Welcome everyone to Children's Online and Connected Toys panel. I am not Jackie Hughes, so I apologize for that in advance. Jackie was going to moderate two different panels for us, but then she had the opportunity to get a surgery. Fruition. In addition to that, we then have Jacob Orvik-Stott, who is with the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, bringing to fruition the Children's Code, operationalizing it, bringing the enforcement mechanism, and really how to do this. And we're going to talk a lot about this, because the how to do the Children's Code, how to protect children's online interactions is extremely cutting edge kind of issues. Next, we have Julie Dawson of Yoti, and Yoti is an absolute leader in the space at solving and operationalizing these key challenges for children and building in the kinds of protections that are necessary. And finally, Isabella Siddiqui, the kind of founder and leader of Happy Kids. She's going to tell us what it's like to build this organization from the perspective of the kids and the approach and steps that they take to ensure that kids are having the right experience. And so we really have that full circle approach. I'm going to stop talking because I want them to tell you about sort of their background and how they approach the space. And we're going to start with Baroness Bevan-Kidron. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. So I think that, you know, the genesis of the code was really that at Five Rights we had sort of worked out pretty early on that children were being treated as if they were adult online. That was the central problem. It wasn't that anyone was deliberately you know, maligning or undermining children. It was that they had created an environment that was intended for one use, and then suddenly you find, you know, 1 in 3 users around the globe are under 18, and they are not being properly considered. And so I do, as you sort of alluded to, I have a slightly double hat. I am the chair of Five Rights Foundation, but I'm also a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. And when the legislation came to the Lords that was about data privacy, I saw actually what I would really like to suggest was an opportunity, but also a duty to work out what that meant for kids. Now, a lot of the time I spend with other lawmakers, you know, and activists of all kinds, you know, they sort of talk about the fact that this is a very quickly changing environment, and they talk about the fact that, you know, we really don't have anything to look at. We don't have the rules of the road. And so, you know, that is both a freedom, if you like, and a problem. So I decided to choose to see it as a freedom. And I literally sat down and I thought about all the things that the kids had been telling me, you know, in our workshops about how they felt and what they needed and what the world was that they wanted to be involved in. And I reimagined the data situation on their behalf, right? Now, that is a very, very sort of crude way of saying it, but I think I'd like to point out 3 things and then maybe give way to others to sort of get this thing going. The 3 things were that really, you know, both children themselves and their parents and other adults in the world never thought a 13-year-old was an adult. So the age with which we were considering the boundary between childhood and adulthood was simply wrong. That was number 1. And so the code is for users under 18. And that is a remarkable shift in policy thinking in the tech arena. Number 2 was the only sort of things that were out there were very firmly at sites directed at children. And again, you know, you have to protect children, or you have to give them what they need where they are. You can't assume they're where you want them to be. And in fact, most children spend most of the time in places that are not for 13 directed at them. And then the third thing, and perhaps most controversially, but I would say most shape-shifting in terms of the code and what's happened next, was I thought, it's not true we don't have rules. That there are children's rights. The 196 countries are signed up. They have existing rights, and these are well-worn, and we've worked out what children need and to a degree what they want. And what if we apply that to this situation and actually see it as a rights-based approach? And I think, obviously I left Jacob and his colleagues with a whole set of problems to solve, in this process. But actually, there were a whole lot of clues in those three things. And that's really what the code did. The code had on the face of the bill those three things. A child was a person under 18. You had to uphold the existing rights. And it was any service likely to be accessed by children. And maybe I can stop there and come back later.
And a perfect transition to Jacob. Jacob, if you will walk us through kind of receipt of that, right? Receiving the children's code and being handed this really delicate, really soft law-oriented law, and the challenge of implementing that. It'd be great to hear that perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, as you both alluded to already, my role wasn't necessarily to write the code. My role was slightly daunting, and it was to deliver our work on the code transition period. So just for background, for those of you that may not be aware, when the code was launched, we at the ICO opted to give industry a 1-year transition period, which essentially was an amnesty period for them to get their house in order before we began to sort of formally enforce and investigate and ensure that the code was being introduced. And that transition period ended exactly a week ago on 2nd of September. And so we've now sort of shifted our focus to supervision. But I think in terms of what our approach was, and again, sort of focusing on the practical steps that you mentioned in your opening remarks, Ryan, I would say our overarching approach throughout the transition has been to try and sustain and develop a bit of an ongoing dialogue with industry and other stakeholders. And this is maybe a bit of a step change to our normal modus operandi, where we would release sort of formal guidance and then expect that to be followed and things like that. And I think this open and ongoing approach has sort of been reflected in how we've produced guidance and support for industry. So we've tried to be iterative as possible, for example, by publishing beta versions for people to test and feedback on of some things. We've run sort of co-design workshops with the UX community to develop sort of prototypes of different guidance and things like that. And I think we sort of took this open and iterative approach for a couple of reasons, really. So the first of these is that while some of the code standards are more prescriptive, others are intentionally more sort of flexible and principles-based. So if you take the transparency standard as an example, that says that privacy information should be age appropriate and accessible, but it stops there and it acknowledges that how this is implemented will vary depending on the age of child users and the nature of the given service. And so it sets a challenge out to online services rather than telling them prescriptive rules. And so the ongoing conversation here has been really important so that both us as an office and industry can come towards a mutual understanding of what conforming with the code looks like in practice, recognizing that people might not get it right first time, and also recognizing that what good looks like will hopefully also change and get better over time as well. And then I think the last sort of thing I'd say on that as well is more broadly that the code isn't a one and done thing. Its fundamental vision is to ask online services to consider children's rights and their best interests when using their data across everything they do. And that requires an ongoing and sustained commitment on their part and ours as well. So it's been a really interesting challenge, and we're really sort of excited by the changes that have been made already, but we also look forward to the next phase in the code's life and hoping that it can be as impactful as possible.
And kudos to you and the ICO, because you've really led from the front in this work with a lot of workshops, a lot of guidance, a lot of discussions, a lot of approaching industry and just being receptive to that kind of dialogue. Your appreciation for the uniqueness of this law is to be applauded. And I want to build on something that Bibin mentioned, which is, children, adults does not start at 13. But also, if you talk about children 18 and under, that's a lot of different children, right? That's a lot of different ages, target age range, and so on. So I want to use that as a transition to Isabella to talk about the uniqueness of dealing with different kinds of children at different age ranges and that process, and then we'll circle back around to complete with Julie to talk about what target age range looks like and how do we get there and how do we even know who we're dealing with online. But Isabella, give us a little bit of background on you and Happy Kid and so on.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you to Wieben and Jakob for these very detailed introductions to your work. I am based in Geneva in Switzerland and started about 16 years ago now. It was initially just a club, and the idea was to help parents with the various parenting issues that we're confronted with. And the community grew, and we decided to create a website and to put some resources online. And then we also organized conferences and workshops to help parents get to know each other and to share all these best practices and give each other guidance and support. Now, as you mentioned earlier, Ryan, one of the main concerns, if not the main concern for parents nowadays, is clearly the time that parents see their children spending on screens, the ways parents have to try and channel that or reduce that to a minimum. But as you mentioned also, the different ages imply different interests, different abilities, and also different types and sets of rules to be set, or to be opposed by the children, of course, as they become teenagers, because that's another part. But their security online is by far one of the main concerns, because, and it's very important, I think, to acknowledge that very often parents are not as tech-wise or as you say à l'aise in French, which means that they don't master the various technology used by their own children. And it is something that is a great concern, not only to them, but also to all sorts of organizations who try and publish, create, and broadcast all sorts of support items and devices to control that. But it's by far one of the main concerns.
Isabella, thank you for that. And over to Julie in terms of figuring out how to manage who companies are talking to, right? Who these services are impacting is a huge problem from the company side. Whether they want to be figuring this out or don't want to be, regardless, it's a difficult challenge. And now the code in the UK requires this. So talk to us a little bit about Yoti and your work in the space to help really meet the challenges of the children's code.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thanks everyone. Yes, at Yoti, we're looking at how an individual can prove who they are or how old they are, either face-to-face or online. And if you think over the last decade or so, gambling was the first area where young people were obliged to prove they were over 18 in order to be able to go down that route. So the founder of Yoti had worked in that industry for many years and knew that there were ways that were probably more with hard identifiers and documents to prove over 18. But then, now that has gone further than just being for the gambling sector. We're starting to look at a lot more sectors online. But even a few years ago, people said it's too hard, really, to find many ways to prove that someone is over 18. But in the last several years, a whole range of different age and identity providers have moved into this space and come up with new ways. And once the dominoes started toppling and it was proven that you could prove that someone was over 18 in a range of ways, then people started to question, well, is it possible to see that someone's over 13 or under 13? And that's where companies like Yoti have started to innovate and look at a whole range of different ways. So to sort of condense things, we would now offer 6 or 7 different ways that a platform in one integration could set up and then allow their users to have a selection of ways to prove age, just data minimized, just the fact they're over or under a certain age. The trickiest one has been under 13s, and that's where you mentioned interaction and collaboration with regulators, and there we've been hugely privileged to work jointly with the ICO Sandbox team and be part of a number of companies looking at innovations supported and working jointly with the Sandbox team. And we've looked specifically at how you can prove the age of a person under 13. So from 1324, that can be within just 1.5 years of age of accuracy. And we'll soon be announcing how that can be of a similar accuracy for the under 13s. And we'll be publishing that in the next few months. And it's thanks very much to our work in the Sandbox that we've been able to work jointly on that.
Excellent. Julie, thanks for that. And I'm going to jump back to Jacob. Jacob, explain to people what a sandbox is. Explain to people kind of how it works, how you work with people, but also do us the favor of explaining the target age range that the ICO has set out and what that means for reasonableness.
Sure. So maybe if I start with the latter part of your question about what the target age range means. If I understood you correctly, Ryan, what you're referring to is the fact that the code draws the boundaries for child very widely, and it says that anyone under 18 is a child, and that's derived from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, in which the code is grounded, and it acknowledges that people up until that age are developing at different rates, at different stages, and they have different needs and things like that. So obviously within that broad category, there's a wide range of children, and actually the code does itself break down in sort of loose terms, pre-primary years, primary years, things like that, and sort of hints at what the different needs might be for those children without being too prescriptive. And it aims to encourage online services themselves to take a sort of sensible approach to gauging what the age of their users are, using age assurance technologies such as those provided by Yoti and other means and things like that. So that's where the sort of code comes from in terms of age ranges. In terms of the sandbox, Sandbox isn't a totally new concept within the regulatory field. It was first sort of pioneered by the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, but essentially the basic premise is that it's a collaborative experience between the regulator and an innovator, where the regulator gets to understand and see and influence what innovation is happening to ensure that it's done in accordance with the law, so in this case data protection, and in return the innovator gets sort of assurances and guidance on how they can influence and change their products to make sure it's as good as it can be and as accurate as it can be, and conforms with the law and stuff like that. So in practice, what that means is that we work together with the organizations to set goals. We set sort of sprint targets. We talk them through particular sort of knotty policy challenges that they may be encountering and things like that. And we generally work with them to understand how their products can comply with data protection law, as I've sort of mentioned. And the last thing I'll say on that is, at the end of a given sort of sandbox cycle, as a matter of good practice, we publish sort of report on what we've learned for the wider sort of ecosystem to learn from, and we sort of aim to sort of move the dial in that respect as well.
Perfect, thank you. Bevan, why is it important to distinguish between different age ranges? Walk us through examples. I know you have examples with Twisted Toys, walk us through the different impacts and ways that children interact at different age.
So I think it's always useful to sort of really imagine a real life scenario. So you go, would you send your 4-year-old out the front door, on the bus to go get something by themselves? And, you start laughing because of course you wouldn't. And that actually might be that might actually attract the attention of the law, in fact, if you did. But equally, and yet if you ask the same question about the 17-year-old, you'd be ridiculous not to. So I think the first thing is that both parents and actually more formally, child development experts have a very clear idea of how children develop. I think where it becomes particularly interesting and sort of, in this context is things like, the concept of trust. Very young teenagers don't really have that concept of sort of, risk and trust and how you negotiate that. And actually, it has, interestingly, two effects. Some go very, very bold, and some go terribly frightened. Yeah, so they're not even at the same age. They're not the same. But you can sort of take a guess that an 11-year-old needs more help and more signals and more signposting, you know, around what might be really, really obvious to someone who's 16 or 17. So I think that Jacob said it rather well. You know, he said sort of indicating, you know, that the code indicates how you might think about it. And I do want to just, if you don't mind, pick up on two things. Really, one is that the code is really not only about age. Age is one piece of it, you know, because actually, unless you know they're there, it's difficult to know how to treat them. And most people sort of jump to something like adult content. But actually, even if you're trying to give them a video of your terms and conditions, instead of, you know, 300 pages of material for someone with a law degree, you know, you have to know roughly how old, and as Julie will say, you know, you can have different levels of efficacy about how much, depending on how serious it is, the engagement. So I think, first of all, you know, age is not the only issue. It's about how you treat them once you get there. And I would say the same about Isabella's point. You know, it's not, as she knows, you know, it's not just about screen time. It's about what kind of screen time. And no parent would mind a child sort of, you know, a budding Mozart spending hours and hours and through the night and giving up their sleep, you know, to spend time in that environment and build something creatively. What we're really looking at, and what the code is really trying to prevent, is sort of egregious data practice, which has the effect of extending use, has the effect of targeting, has the effect of over-revealing, has the effect of keeping them up all night. And I just, you know, want to say that the 15 sort of standards within the code are quite intentional in that it's not a pick and mix. You have to do all of them. And so if you data minimize and you have high privacy by default, and then you don't recommend or use their profile to recommend things that you know are not in their best interest, et cetera, it's a narrowing band of lousy things that can happen to a kid. Yeah, and no one code and no one piece of legislation will solve all the problems of children on the internet. But I think that what is valuable for the community, and you mentioned the global community, and many other lawmakers around the world are now looking at this, is it's a new approach. It says, look at all of these things in the round and make your judgment, and the role of the regulator will be to say, did you fairly judge? Did you cynically judge? Did you judge to the best of the knowledge and ability that you have that those 15 things have been done well? And I think that approach has a lot of value, and we've seen a lot of change as a result.
Perfect. Thank you for that. What I want to do is, so I'm getting feedback. Even, can you go on mute? I think that might be where it's coming from. Okay, good. So, sorry, that's probably technology. I'm sure that's not on her side. What I want to characterize really quickly, and then go to Isabella for follow-up on that, is the Children's Code is the law in the UK. It's only in the UK. Unfortunately, at the same time, maybe this is some of the political challenges of Brexit and so on, but in the EU, they've just put out the Artificial Intelligence Act, which looks at high-risk AIs. And it has very few words about children, and very few words about children in high risk. And from For Humanity's perspective, that was unfortunate, because here you are sitting with the UK with literally a gold standard, cutting edge law in protecting children, and yet at an EU level, a European level, Isabella, probably at a Swiss level as well, those same protections aren't there and have not been adopted. Now, to Beeben's point, in the US, we had two House of Representatives, Lori Trahan and Kathy Castor, join Ed Markey as senator, and they recently pinged 12 different gaming institutions in the US and said, you need to look at the Children's Code, which is great. It's fantastic. However, one other thing I want to point out in this whole miasma of process is that the Children's Code does not exist robustly without GDPR. Without GDPR, do you have appropriate data protections? And guess what? The United States doesn't have that. Don't even have anything close to that. So figuring out how we can properly protect children in that context, I kind of want to hand that back to Isabella from your perspective in Switzerland, surrounded by Europe, next door to the UK with this great new law. What do you see as kind of the need, and what do we need to do to help where you sit?
I will try to speak a bit louder. Apparently my mic is not functioning so well, so don't hesitate to let me know if you can't hear me properly, because I don't want to scream or yell, but still, I will try to speak as loud as I can. I will just say as a forward, I am not a legislator myself, so I am not a lawyer, and I will not be able to give you the point of view really fully detailed from the law perspective. What I can give you is the parents' perspective, the family's perspective, and everything that has to do with raising children in the various countries that are concerned, whether it's the EU or Switzerland, because I have a lot of families from everywhere in Europe and in Switzerland. As you know, Geneva is the place where, as in New York, there are a lot of international organizations which are based. And as I was searching through the various texts that exist, I was trying to come up with more documented answers to this specific question before the conference. What I found out is that there is the ITU, which is the International Telecommunication Union, which started to write guidelines for all of the countries in the world which are members of the ITU, which covers basically all continents. And that was already in 2009, with a project to create what they called COP guidelines, which were exactly what you have now as a formal law through the Children's Code. But since 2009 until today, they have not managed to put together a law that applies to every country, to every continent. So I would say here in Switzerland, the law is GDPR, exactly as you mentioned. That's what protects the data, the using data, whether it's for adults or for children. There's no distinction in between the two. And apart from that, there is nothing. So there are organizations which try to help, which try to set up regulations, but there's not a specific code like you have the Children's Code.
Thank you for that. Beeben, please.
Just very briefly, I think that's absolutely true, Isabella. But I do know that the European Data Protection Board have it on their work plan, and the Italian Data Protection Commissioner, and in fact the Irish Commissioner just published her fundamentals, as did the OECD. So I think the point is that there is, I mean, absolutely right, there is not anything, but I think there are a few things on the way, and many of the changes that have happened in anticipation of the code actually have been global. Jacob would have to say if there are some exceptions to that, but it has been interesting that once they make the change, they make them globally. So that gives us a little hope.
And I'm going to come to Julie in a second. I will also add, we've had specific discussions with the Swiss Data Authority. And I don't know if Jacob has heard this or been part of those conversations differently, but with regard to our work on GDPR, the Swiss Data Authority has said, if the ICO approves it, it's good enough for us. We will approve it. And so I expect that won't be true of the Children's Code, because what they'll be saying is we've approved GDPR for those who need to abide by GDPR, but that's not the law of the land, and in Switzerland. We're working on the Swiss version of that. We'll have to see what they're willing to do around the children's code in terms of it. They'll make it authoritative, but as it applies to the UK still, not necessarily applying as law in Switzerland. Julie, do you want to pick up on that thread?
Yes, it's a very linked point. So I think what we've seen on the ground in the last 3 to 6 months is that there's been an absolute catalyst provided by this work. And we're seeing that both sort of top down and bottom up. We're seeing it top down that across companies that operate globally, they've clocked this. And all of their data protection teams and increasingly all of their design teams are alert to this. And if they're doing it for one country, a lot of them, thankfully, are having the conscious moment of thinking, well, we shouldn't just be looking at one country. So I think the tinderbox has thoroughly been lit thanks to this incredible effort over the last years. And bottom up, I mean, I think some of the design workshops, Jacob, that are coming out of the ICO team are also spreading across the design community. And there we will also see people literally who are within companies at grassroots level wanting to pick that up. And I see a really strong parallel with, if you look at the movement around accessibility and WCAG 2.1AA guidelines, where actually it's a note of pride amongst designers now to be looking at, I want to get to level, not just A, but level AA. And I think we'll have a similar movement over the next period, as you were saying, as that best practice starts to be shared. So irrespective of the fact that initially the first country has been the UK, we know that Ireland has got a great set of work it's been doing. The Netherlands in the Code voor Kinderrechten has also been looking at this. And the language that we've heard coming through in the US, we're starting to hear in other parts of the world as well. So the term age appropriate has never been used as much as in the last couple of months. And I think we'll hear more of it.
Well, and actually a really great transition to Jacob. What does age appropriate mean? Put that in context of how entities can achieve age appropriateness and prove it as we begin to be compliant with the law. As you said, it's 7 days into we must be compliant with the law. Now, I'm sure you're not running around with a heavy stick at the moment, as people are still sort of catching up. But tell us what it means to be age appropriate. How do we understand what that is?
I'm really sorry, Ryan. I lost the first part of your question, so I'm going to attempt to respond. But if I'm going off on a wild tangent, then just please rein me in. But in terms of what it means to be age appropriate, I think it's about acknowledging, as we've already kind of touched upon at the moment, that children have unique needs. That will depend on their age, but it doesn't just depend on their age. It depends on who they are as a person, their wider capabilities and things like that. So it's about creating a space within an online service to allow them to articulate what their needs are and to design with high privacy defaults and high safety defaults in mind, and then allowing children to explore in more adventurous ways where feasible and allowable off their own back, rather than assuming that the default is that they're an adult or that they can tolerate a high sort of risk threshold or that they understand loads about data and how their privacy is used and stuff. So the code puts the onus and the responsibility on online services to design their services in this way. And an example of that would be, again, the sort of transparency standard where it says, keep your privacy information and choices simple as a first port of call, but then give a child an opportunity to ask for more detail if they do want it and if they have a high level of understanding and things like that. So it's about taking a nuanced approach to children and keeping the high standards at the front of mind at the design of services.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And in that context, I'll share really quickly some of my personal struggles in drafting a code certification, which is the American perspective of how we treat children. And so, Beeban, I want to come to you in terms of the rights of the child, because the rights of the child are now codified in the law. But I will tell you, as an American parent, part of the culture is to look at some of that and be like, really? Like, that should be one of their rights? And it's getting used to that. Because I would tell you, reading through those rights, I support those rights, but maybe not at the same time and speed. It's a little bit of the context that you talked about of, one 11-year-old might be here and another 11-year-old's here. talk to us about the rights of the child.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're referring to is something that I experience whenever I'm talking to American colleagues, which is it's sort of what about the parent is really what happens here. And the reason that I'm laughing, you know, is I almost knew what you were going to ask, because I have it in my response mechanisms now. You know, what about me, says the parents. And I think that the short answer is we actually have developed a situation where parents are forced to babysit the technology instead of the child. And I think that is my best way of saying the truth of now, yeah, which is this is not in spite of all the words like platform, this is not a sort of something without a view, without an impact, without a set of outcomes that are preordained by its design. No, we know what it's optimized for. And because it's optimized for engagement, it actually means a set of outcomes for the kids. So actually, I am the first to say there is a role for parents. There's a huge role for parents in children's lives in general. And we see on and offline, those kids who don't have sort of, you know, decent relationships with adults in their lives who have the caring role, whatever that might be, really suffer disproportionately. So that is quite different from actually putting pressure, as Jacob said, on the platforms to say, hey, you know, a little less poison in the water here. And I think that the other thing that we haven't sort of mentioned that sort of comes into this piece is, you know, all the services we use, whether it is a vehicle to get to school, whether it is in school itself, whether it's the school dinner, you know, whether it's the teacher, they have training and rules and arrangements and even the fact that you're not allowed to keep your kid out of school without telling the authorities. You know, parents don't have absolute rights over children. And people who create environments for children have duties to them. And I think that tech has sort of got away, particularly the last decade, with this sort of cry of exceptionality. Yeah. And they're not really exceptional. They're big businesses with big, you know, payrolls and big profit and doing, you know, doing what they do for reasons that do not preclude them from making sure that all their optimization happens after they've taken care of the rights and safety of children. And actually, when you put it that way, even in America, I have never heard an American parent say, actually, that's not right. Because they suddenly see that they're not being cut out of this situation. Actually, they're being given something that they can then negotiate about, because you just have to start talking to parents about the negotiations that they have with children, and they are really, really distressed. And in the UK, at least, it's over 90% of parents want tech to be regulated and safe.
Yeah, Isabella, please.
Yes, maybe I can give you a few figures that I found. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. 97% of the people who have been surveyed. So there was a survey amongst parents, amongst families, and 97% of the parents said that they thought their children were capable of circumventing any of the rules that they would put in place, whether it's regarding their screen time or what they see and what they do while they're on their screens. That's one thing. 97% is very high. Then I don't have the figure here right now, but it's the percentage of parents who think that they know what their children are doing online, and the percentage of their children who is this much bigger, saying actually they have no clue of what we're doing online. And I can also tell you the number of children I know who, when I check on Facebook or somewhere else, they say that they're 27 when they're actually 8 or 9. I mean, they find ways of circumventing. And what I was going to say as well is that most of the companies who are designing, whether it's the games, whether it's the the YouTube channels or anything, they have implemented addictive behavior as a guideline. It's how can they bring the children back on the screen and keep them on the screen as long as possible. So there's a bit of a frustration amongst parents. It's not only that the children know how to circumvent all of this, but it's also a bit like David against Goliath, because whether it's YouTube or the others, the features that are implemented are designed to keep our children online, and that's all the harmful disasters it has on their health. So Biban, I think you'd like to say something. I'm very interested in finding out how the children's code can actually regulate how the design, the intention that is behind how these various games, toys, or whatever are being designed on purpose.
Listen, I think you've made the most important point, and I have two very short answers for you. One is that is exactly why it's a children's rights approach. It's why it's shifting responsibility from parents and children to the tech companies to have, as Jacob has said, default settings that don't allow some of those things that you've described. And that's why I made that sort of slightly lousy joke, is that you're babysitting the technology instead of the kid. Listen, it will never be perfect, but I think that if you start with a fighting chance, that there is another part, which is that actually kids, if it starts high and they lower it, if they go through an age system and they cheat it, they know they're transgressing. We have a current situation where children are told it is normal to be served up this self-harm thing. It's normal to find yourself with adult content on your phone in the playground. It's normal to be up all night on a game. And so actually even the moment of transgression is actually quite important. But I think, and I think that maybe Jake will say more about it, but the code itself is geared to change some of the reality that you describe.
Yeah, Jacob, do you want to pick up on that thread? And then I want to go to Julie as well, because I want Julie to share how they're operationalizing that at Yoti. But Jacob, help people to understand about nudging, profiling, etc.
Yeah, sure. So I think the code standards articulate what needs to happen, but they also articulate how online services need to show us and demonstrate that it's happening as well. So one of the sort of core aspects of this is the data protection impact assessment. In that assessment, these online services will need to document their thought processes behind what they're doing with children's data. They need to show they've properly identified all the possible risks, mitigated them wherever possible, and things like that. And we have sort of formal powers, and we will use formal powers to go and look at those things, audit companies, and make sure that they've thought behind things and that they have an evidence base behind things as well. And I think similarly on the sort of circumvention of measures and rules, we will expect online services to have evidence that what they have implemented is working quite well and things like that. And they've got a number of tools at their disposal to do that. So right the way through from very simple sort of user surveys about how things are going, right the way through to sort of external independent audits and things like certifications that sort of give standards for age assurance, things like that. So there's a number of sort of different ways that they can go about proving to us and evidencing that they are actually in practice meeting the spirit of the code, but we will be expecting them to prove that to us.
Julie, can you pick up on that, please?
Yeah, I think there's some really important things that we as companies that are providing these types of solutions have to do on the transparency front. I like that point right at the beginning on your initial screen, that everybody wants tech that is both trustworthy and transparent. So saying in plain, simple terms, the parent, the child, the regulator, the relying parties can all understand what the hell is under the hood. You know, how good is it? How does it work across different skin tones? How does it work across different genders? How does it work for each age group? And explaining that in a straightforward fashion that you don't need a PhD to understand is really important. Getting things benchmarked by companies that can look at like for like and can look at, is this data set consented? How was it, brought about? Other things that I think as companies it's incumbent on us to do is work with other companies, look at interoperability. So I'm sat here today in Greece where the EU consent project is working, and within that is work also to develop a new international ISO standard around age checking. So a couple of years ago, there was some work that was kicked off under PAS, which is a sort of before a standard was created around age checking. And now that's being taken on a notch to create something which will hopefully over the next year get reviewed in lots of countries and come out as an ISO standard. And hopefully that will dovetail really well with the principles that have come out recently from Five Rights. And I think from what we're seeing, that there's a really good interconnection there. So I think it's absolutely looking at the transparency side, working with other players. And we take that very much to heart in terms of publishing regularly how good the different approaches are and trying to be really open about those. And yeah, keeping on innovating. And that's one of the things that is really key. There are some regulators we have been able to work with that have a system where they say, you have passed the bar, which I think is super helpful. Lots of countries haven't gone down that route. Germany is one of them. So we try and work wherever there are bodies that are doing that. And the work coming out from For Humanity, looking at UCAS accreditation around meeting this type of code is also super helpful. So we think that the more companies out there that have their innards exposed and say this is how we're doing it, will be helpful across the board for both regulators, for companies, and for parents and kids.
And Julie, I'm going to come right back to you on this point, which is it's an entirely different legal regulatory environment from there's no comment about what nudging is or what conditioning is or what profiling is, to now saying you may not nudge in a way that's harmful to the child. Because now you have a standard to meet. You may not understand what that standard means, right? You may not know how to manage what it means to not nudge negatively, but now you do have to think about it. And so from Yoti's perspective, what does that mean? How have you started to deal with that? It's really a risk, right? It's a legal regulatory compliance risk now that didn't exist before, right?
So we look at it from two perspectives. One, our app, Yoti's app product, is provided from 13 to 17-year-olds. So we've been going through this entire process with that hat on. And then on the other side of the fence, we provide age tools so that other companies, be they a dating platform, an adult platform, a gaming platform, a console manufacturer, can also meet the code, which has been super helpful because we've seen it from both sides of the fence. I think absolutely what has been really clear and going through the suggested audit approach of each of the different sections means that you have to have everybody in your company understand this. It's not just somebody in legal, it's not just somebody in design, it's really something culturally that has to go across the business. And that's why I see a strong parallel with the work on accessibility. You know, your people in customer support have to know how are they going to deal with a young person. When we've been looking at our FAQs, we've had to think, right, which of the top 30 or so FAQs, and is that understandable by the youngest age that could potentially come here? Oh, and there's actually a really good positive knock-on that if you look at literacy levels across the population, which is about the age of a sort of, 9 to 10 Sun newspaper in the UK, if you're looking at all levels of literacy, that is actually a huge benefit. So I think there's a lot of things that this code is going to drive in terms of a behaviour change towards being more thoughtful, acting in the best interest of the child, but that will also have a much wider knock-on, I think, for many people across society. And getting your whole team, not just your engineers, not just your policy people, but all of the different parts of the company need to cotton on and understand what this means as parents, but as also employees delivering these types of tech solutions.
And thank you. Perfect segue to Beben in terms of education and awareness. To me, one of the biggest challenges of the Children's Code and implementing it and meeting it is that a lot of entities won't even know how to do it. What is required to understand it, what is required to be age appropriate, and so on. And so talk to us a little bit about that educational process. And I also want to pick up on a question that Chris Leong asked, which is also about educating children on online risks. So his question was about TikTok and sort of risks that may be associated with that, whereas the typical response from a child might be, oh, I'm just dancing, right? And I'm just showing my friends my dancing. Helping them to understand education about all of these risks and challenges. Can you pick up on that thread, please?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Two very big questions there. I think one thing that I'm actually going to echo Julie a little bit, which is that the code itself is sort of an education. And over the last 3 or 4 years, I've spoken to a lot of product designers, a lot of people inside the tech industry. And, and after about, I would say somewhere between 20 and 25 minutes, they go, I never thought about it like that before. Right? And I think the code is society's requirement to think about it that way now. And actually, not only now, before you roll something out, yeah, and about your service. So I think that is actually the strength of the code, and the strength of it being not a law with everything on the, on the face of the bill, but actually a code that says what the regulator is expecting you to do, and they take a view on it because they are asking you to take a view. And I am very excited to say that one of the biggest platforms in the world actually now has someone who can explain best interest of children to every product team, irrespective of what the service is about. Yeah, and that's a big win for children. It just is. It's a big win for children. And in my view, if it's a big win for children, it's a big win for parents and humanity at large.
Yes.
On your other point, on your other point is, and actually I should do a shout out to the ICO, because they have actually been very aware that people didn't know, and they have actually provided a vast amount of guidance. And if you actually just plod through everything, a lot of it is actually there. And we at Five Rights similarly have tried to sort of educate. I think for the children piece, it's a little bit more complicated. And I think the first thing I would say is, again, a lot of people go, well, can't we just educate the kids? And I go, well, no, you can't educate the kids to accept something that is deeply unjust. Yeah, you mustn't. Yeah. And in fact, because of the way that we work at Five Rights, which is that all of our sort of thought and policy and intelligence, not in the clever sense, but in the understanding the landscape sense, actually comes from working with children. And we do workshops that honestly, that when we run a workshop, we explain what information is, we explain what a data bank is, we explain what an algorithm is, and we do exercises, and they're running around the room. And after, I can explain to any 11-year-old in the land what algorithmic bias is, and by the time we work that out, they are furious, absolutely furious, because children have quite a sort of evolved sense of justice and fairness. So I think we absolutely can and must educate the kids, but there is a really fundamental problem, which is a sort of an education capture. And if you look around the world, particularly I know for a fact in the UK and America and increasingly in Europe, the people teaching kids about tech are Facebook and Google in our schools. And they are not teaching about algorithmic bias, and they are not teaching about the things that Isabella was talking about. What they're talking about is stranger danger. They're blaming the bad actors, but they're not actually incorporating their own bad acting. So actually, it will not surprise, but I think we actually need minimum standards, for education in schools. And we say, if you are going to undertake education, it must cover all of these modules. And that seems to be very much like curriculum to me, with trained teachers. But even if you're doing it as an extracurricular thing, I think you have a duty to teach right across the piece. So I'm sorry if that was a complicated answer, but it's very territory.
It's a beautiful answer, and I want to pass over it. Sorry, I'm using my hands like I'm pointing to Jacob, like he knows I'm pointing to him. Sorry. Coming to Jacob, but I know you want to pick up on Beeben's thread, but I also want to point out the difficulty and the nuance from a corporate perspective that the code can present. And let me just set this up, and you can tackle both points. The code reads that the best interests of the child shall be I'm emphasizing my word for a second, a primary consideration of the entity. Now, for those of you who aren't thinking about it, the primary consideration of every entity that is a for-profit shareholder wealth approach is the best interest of the shareholders. It's profit, right? And so the code says that the best interest of the child shall now be a primary consideration. And I will even confess, from For Humanity's perspective, I started with and we put in a criteria that raised the best interest of the child above the interest of shareholders. Jacob wrote back and said, and by the way, this is how we interact, right? This is how we grow and learn together. Jacob wrote back and said, not a primary consideration. So talk to us about what it means as a company to have a primary consideration and to blend that with the work that companies do, and also feel free to follow up on what Beeben was talking about as well.
Sure, yeah. So maybe if I respond to your question first, Ryan, and then I can revert to following up on Beeben's point. I think the reason that the A primary consideration framing was chosen was A, because it's in the UNCSC, but B, because using the primary consideration might imply that children's rights in all circumstances are inalienable, they are fundamental, universal, and they can't be impeached. Whereas in practice, a primary consideration means that you need to weigh up as an online service the net impact of what you're doing on all children's rights, and then make a fundamental decision about how you can best support children's rights in the round. So sometimes you might have to consider, for example, if it's about sort of serving them content, rights to access to information against sort of rights to be protected from harmful content and things like that. So using the primary consideration maybe is a bit blunt, and that's why a primary consideration acknowledges that there's a nuance, and you need to make sure that the best interests of the child are always on the table. They're a primary consideration, but you need to weigh them up in a common sense and nuanced way with other considerations, and that includes the incentive for organizations to develop a profit, but it means that profit can't be pursued at the expense of children's rights. And then just sort of following up on what Beeben said around sort of the role of public education, I think it can be helpful, but it's definitely not a silver bullet or a panacea. And I think we have to be very realistic about the level of expectation that we put on not just children, but all people as a whole to manage their digital lives. I think I saw a study, I think it was 2014, so God knows what the state is now 7 years later, but the average adult in America would take 2 weeks to read all of the privacy policies per year that they use and stuff like that. So we can't expect too much of people. And I think the code starts from a position that the responsibility is on services to inbuild safeguards into their services, and then take children on that journey by explaining what's happened, explaining what rights they do have, rather than putting all of the responsibility on the child to navigate, or parents as well, to navigate their lives in isolation, which is probably unhelpful and untenable.
Excellent, thank you for that. Isabella, I want to come back to you in terms of the relationship between children learning on their own and parents interacting with them. What's the right kind of balance, or what do you see is the reaction of the community, and where do you think we can sort of go that's better, or that improves this relationship, this almost triangulated relationship between children, parents, and online?
I would say education is clearly the way. Education of the parents, education of the children, and above all this, education of those who produce all of that, whether companies, and I completely agree with what you were saying before. The nuance between a priority and the priority is clearly that we all know when profit is in the balance, in the scale, it outweighs everything else. So we need to be educated as much as possible on how to help our children navigate, on what are the real dangers, because often we imagine that everything is dangerous. I was reading through the chat, there was a point about being involuntarily hypnotized by an XR gaming device. I mean, there's such a list of hazards, of dangers, and at the same time, we need to know at what age. You were talking about age appropriateness before. At what age, how long should a child stay on the screen? For example, here, what I keep telling parents is that before 2 years old, he shouldn't be exposed to a screen. Yet every single day I see children who are not 2 years old yet with an iPad or with their parents' phone in the hand because it keeps them busy. Why does it keep them busy? I'm going to use the babysitter term you used before, Bivan. It's actually parents using devices as babysitters for their children without them being really aware of what the risks are in terms of health. Why is the child so quiet when he's with a screen in his hand? Because his brain is being not necessarily hypnotized, but clearly it's mobilized in a way that will keep him very quiet and still and focused on that. But it has repercussions, and those health repercussions are not always, parents are not educated enough about that. And children themselves, as they grow up, because 0 to 2, it's the parent really who is responsible 100% for what the child is doing with the device. But as from 2, children themselves should already be better educated on what the risks are, that they are actually incurring when they're going on online. And then there's also simply the fact that data is being used from our children's activities, which has an impact on just like an advertising on TV. I don't know, you're seeing a movie and then you have an ad for an ice cream or for whatever chocolate, and you feel you have the urge for that. Children are being bombarded by that constantly all day long, and not only on their screens, but specifically very, very well aimed at during their screen time. So I know it's a bit désordonné. There's a lot of elements in my answer, but I'm saying we need to be educated as parents, educated as creators of devices, as producers of devices, and educate our children. Clearly, for me, it's the main focus to have.
Julie, in terms of understanding how entities will be interacting with children for children's content, but also interacting with the parents, can you characterize what the responsibilities look like in both vectors when children's products are being offered, and with kind of this backdrop of this educational aspect that Isabelle is talking about for the parents in terms of raising their children in an online world?
That's quite a big question. We've tried to look at it in a couple of different ways. So one, what can we provide to the organizations who are in turn using our products that might be from this really young age all the way through to adulthood? And then there's what we provide in our services directly, which are mainly for 13s and above. And we have quite a different set of messaging and content. But because we're providing some services which are from a much broader age range from really young, that's forced us to think through this quite a bit more and think, what is it you can provide to STEM learning environments, to in-school environments, to the informal education setting, to parents, as well as to regulators and as well as to the companies, because actually there's quite a lot of different audiences that you're trying to explain this to. So over the last year, we've met with the likes of uniformed organizations, your scouts and guides, and trying to understand how do they see explaining AI going forwards. They've got digital making, digital creation badges at the moment. Were they thinking of this sort of a badge? There's organizations like Teens in AI, Apps for Good, Coder Dojo, Code Club, Raspberry Pi Foundation that are already in that trajectory of creating really inspiring experiences. But then we've also looked during the pandemic, is this suitable, something that can work with the school curriculum? And over the past year, I think that's been really hard because a lot of schools around the world have been struggling to really get the basics over. Then we've looked at parents' networks and how do you reach parents and what are the best ways there? So it's not one simple set of communications to one audience. You're really having to look at this quite broadly. And we've been trying to find what can we provide that others can use that are a step removed. We're not, for example, a games console manufacturer, but if they were to use our solutions, what is it that would help them communicate in turn? So it's not a one set of communications for all, but it's trying in general to always make it clear and simple, and to look at how you can bring that to life visually for a range of audiences, from your really simple all the way through to the most in-depth knowledge for a regulator with a tech department looking at the cybersecurity elements, the data responsibility, and for NGOs and those types of bodies who are absolutely wanting and should be scrutinizing this, through to parents, and not patronizing anyone on that journey. So it's quite a lot of things that we think we need to be developing. And as I mentioned, I'd be really delighted to learn more of some of the workshops you've run with young people to see if there are things we can learn from that, because this is the type of thing that is important. We're looking to produce some blogs, which is what is the journey we've gone on, because it's definitely not a finished symphony. It is evolving as the products that we design keep evolving to meet the market. Things like the parental consent solutions at the conference I was at today, people are starting to look at, is there really more of a view around a proxy for age with parental consent, given that there's no international notion of parental guardianhood with a specific link? Is it that we have to move to a proxy? But then how does that get expressed in legislation today differently? So that's why I think groups of practice where practitioners, regulators, and the NGOs are working together is what's needed in this period.
Thank you for that, Julie. Bevan, I want to come to you now. And, everyone here on this panel would gladly work together to advance this work. That the nice thing about this panel is it's not contentious. We don't have TikTok on the panel sort of telling us why it's hard to be compliant with the Children's Code in different ways, or being compliant and the steps they're taking to do it, right? Not trying to call anybody out, or that's not the point. But this group here would love to advance this work. And so in that context, what I'm curious about from the four of you is what's still missing? What are we fearful still of that's not being protected? Is it combining Children's Code with online harms? Or other thing? I want to just give that as maybe a small, I'll get it. I got it. No. So, is there something out there that we're still worried about that maybe the Children's Code doesn't do, and that we should be preparing for kind of the next round? Because this is a dynamic marketplace. It's moving all the time. I think it was Julie who mentioned, or maybe Isabella, about VR, right? And I'll just share a very quick story. My son, the AT&T, the telephone company, had this ad where they used the Imagination song from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And my 2-year-old son would hear that, and regardless of what he was doing, right, he would hear that song and he would completely stop and freeze. And so that hypnosis, that control, that power that can be associated with where kids are at, is that one of those things? What are the things that you worry about next? And we'll start with Bevan.
So sorry about the call. I think there's two parts to your question. I mean, absolutely, there are next steps, and absolutely one data code in one country does not do the deed. Yeah. I do think it is huge and shape-shifting because it thinks about things in a different way. And so I think it defines a lot of other things that will come next. And in fact, I'm actually sitting in my office in Parliament in London, and we had the first public committee on the pre-legislative scrutiny of the online safety bill this morning, available on Parliamentary website to all. But the reason that I say it is we've got an enormous, huge, very complex bill, out of which many such codes should come, and they might be, if they might be about moderation, they may be about age assurance, they may be about what we mean by freedom of speech and what the edges of that are, what we mean by a newspaper, etc., etc. So I think there's an awful lot up for grabs, but what the world is collectively saying, a global consensus now, which is this is not an unregulated space, and it's a complex space, just like any other business. In fact, it is actually transportation and e-commerce and communication and so on. It's actually probably more complex than any other area. But we're going to start saying, hang on a minute, every person in the chain of responsibility now has to pick up their responsibility, and let's make it appropriate to their power, to their place, and so on. So we don't have the heaviest weight on a child and the least weight on a global company, right? So definitely there is more. And I know you didn't want to call them out, but I am actually going to call them out, which is actually, we have seen in the last few weeks, some really terrible kind of pushing back on academics at NYU who are trying to find data about what's actually going on in the black box. We saw a report about the amount of lobbying that's going on in the EU from the tech sector. We had our own report at Five Rights called Pathways, which shows how algorithmically, the companies are providing harmful material to people who they are targeting with advertising at the same time, so they know their age. They're giving children adverts and then showing self-harm, suicide, pornography. It's unbelievable. So I would say the people we're calling out now here today are those guys, and say, come to the party. Everybody on this call knows what. We don't all know how, but we're giving it a damn good try. Yeah, but we do know what. And until and unless these guys come to the party, lawmakers like myself will just keep going. And I think we're going to see a decade of regulation and legislation. And weirdly, it didn't really have to be like this.
I'm cheering deeply. So, well, we are certainly birds of a feather, and For Humanity is here to serve you as you go along that journey. Now, Jacob, being on the regulatory side, probably not wise for him to opine on the next fear, but take the Children's Code from an enforcement point of view and talk as much as you're comfortable about sort of how that will happen and how you want to sort of bring the Children's Code to fruition in terms of compliance, as much as you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, of course. I guess the first thing I'd say is regulators are basically professional warriors, so this is actually quite a comfortable space for me to chat about. In terms of our immediate priorities, we set this out in a blog a couple of weeks ago. We'll be focusing on social media, gaming, and streaming services as our sort of next 6-month sprint of supervision. And that's because we recognise through the course of our work in the transition period, also at this time, these probably the highest data literacy to children. That doesn't mean we're going to be blind to other sectors, but we'll be proactively supervising in these areas, asking people for information, doing random audits, things like that, whilst keeping an eye on the bigger picture. So that's the short term. I think there's a general challenge for us as an office, not just with the code in terms of balancing immediate with the long term. As you've said, Brian, there's VR and massive attendant challenges there. There's things like emotional profiling what does it mean if, you know, technologies for reading sort of brain impulses and thought patterns progress? What happens, you know, if some moonshot technology suddenly comes out of nowhere and things like that? So it's a constant balance for us between keeping one eye on the future whilst making sure we don't sort of abandon post and tackle the biggest problems for us today. So that's my biggest personal worry, finding the sweet spot between protecting people now and working out how we will need to protect people in the future before it sort of gets too late.
And to that end, I will share a conversation that we had with an EU commissioner. And this person was reflecting on the success that the ICO has been having with GDPR certification schemes, with Children's Code. And by the way, he encouraged the ICO to come to the EDPB and come to Europe and basically share its experience. They want to know how to operationalize that too, and they value your input on that. And I just want to pass that message along, that there is interest in the work that you are doing and learning and growing from that, because there is alignment. And so again, as I shared with Bevan, that For Humanity stands ready to provide whatever help and service along these ways as we can. You know, we stand ready to serve you in your role as well. Isabella, what do you worry about?
You're asking me what I worry about?
What's next? I mean, we're covering, we're trying to help a little bit with the Children's Code. We're kind of headed in the right direction, but still on. What concerns you?
I would say if we can get some attention, some communication, some media coverage on the Children's Code in Switzerland and in other countries in the EU. I'll just make a quick parenthesis here. It is kind of difficult right now to communicate on anything else but the pandemic, right? So I am very happy we're all here now discussing this issue, because quite frankly, the pandemic is just all over the media and is taking up everything. But parenthesis closed. I would say the ideal next step would be to, as you said, the EU would be interested in seeing how to learn from the Children's Code. I would be more than happy to help if that is possible in Switzerland and in maybe other countries as well, because I very often say it's so important to capitalize on the great work that has been done somewhere and to try and just adapt it somewhere else instead of reinventing the wheel each time. And in this case, I think we have an incredible job that has been done, and it's kind of state-of-the-art legislation that we have here. In terms of, as you said, Bevan, really, your intention was to defend the children's interest from the beginning, and that is how the legislation was drafted, instead of writing laws and oh, there's this group I don't really care about and this group isn't really concerned, but that's okay, and you just disregard so many different groups of society. Children are our future. They are our society tomorrow. They are today our responsibility, but they are going to be tomorrow's humanity. And I think if we can roll out what the Children's Code is now, I'm sorry, English is not my mother tongue, so sometimes I have to find my words, but what the Children's Code is doing in England now, in the UK now, is something that can be applied to all these other countries, and I'd be just ecstatic if it works.
And Julie, just passing to you, I want to change the question just a little bit in terms of the difficulty operationalizing, meaning what sort of barriers to entry are you finding in terms of the enabling or the ability to help those implement the Children's Code, but also the tools that you bring to the table for sort of just advancing protections in general?
I'd say the lack of harmonization is really hard. So we know, as you mentioned, Ryan, there's definitely a pool of opinion and thought in the US, and we have the UK pocket, Thankfully, now we have this new piece of work going across Europe with the EU Consent Project. But we do need to have some Chatham House discussions between all of those regulatory bodies and all of those people sharing what they're learning. That probably should be behind closed doors, working out what is not good enough, what is good, where are people circumventing. So if we go back and learn some of the lessons from the Digital Economy Act, there's clearly some really good understanding from regulators as to, we need to review this in 6, in 9, in 12 months. We need to be getting from the ground things such as, where do you need to require independence? What sort of audit should we be doing? How are you going to do this benchmarking and audit? And that's the type of thing, if regulators can be sharing that best practice amongst themselves, that would be super useful. We're quite rare as a tech company to be set up as a B Corp. So that question right at the beginning of only looking at shareholder value is something that we take a different take on, because we have put a pledge in our company's mem and arts that we don't just look at shareholder value, we look more broadly. And trying to encourage more companies to think what is in the interest of the child, what is the interest of society, is quite hard. And so I think one of the things we've got to do is look at how do we encourage that type of innovation and that type of behaviour, and how do we say what frankly isn't good enough, because otherwise people just go to the path of least resistance. It was once a tick box, what's the next most minute thing you can do, which might be disingenuous, but basically means you're not under the radar for another 12 months. And that type of best practice and knowledge needs to be shared. Similarly, things such as data sets. We know that we are being offered non-consented data sets, which might say consented on the top level. You go 3 levels down and you look at the data and it's clearly not consented. But if nobody does that degree of due diligence, then that is really hard for companies. So we need forensic devil in the detail review. We need that to be shared across regulators. We need some joining up across the pond. I think Bevan had a wonderful phrase a couple of years ago, which I loved, which was, we can't have little Johnny in his bedroom against Silicon Valley, but it's against companies around the world. We do need to look at this from a different perspective. We need people to engage left and right brain, that they wouldn't want their families and their children, etc., experiencing this. And that's where I think otherwise we might have to have some almost like the hotline of whistleblowing, what is happening in your company that we should know about, because it might take that type of stimulus for things to really change. So whilst I'm optimistic, we've seen a lot more progress in the last 6 months than I think we've seen in the last 6 years. Let's keep that momentum going, and I think through proactive dialogue across these different parties, we could really keep this momentum going.
Fantastic. I'm going to use that as, I'm going to give 1 minute to Isabella, Jacob, and Bevan to close each. So I'm going to go to Isabella first. What's one thing you want? What's one thing? Ask for it. Ask in this community. There are people listening. There are people here who can help advance things. So both to all three, Isabella, Jacob, and Bevan, ask for something. What's the one thing you want to see happen? Say it out loud, because that's the best way to make it happen. Isabella, you're first.
The one thing I would really like to see happening is parents being more aware of the risk their children are encountering, their children are actually under, and immediately in with this, them to be able to act, give us the means to actually ensure our children are safe when they are on the internet, when they are having any of the activities that they're having on screens. Really give us the means, and
Excellent.
It would be wonderful to have that.
Excellent. Jacob, 1 minute. What wish? Talk out loud. What would you like to see?
My slightly cheesy idealist answer is that I think I'd love to see just age-appropriate design being seen as just a commercial and moral imperative rather than something that has to be regulated against. And I hope, possibly naively, that evidence will begin to emerge that age-appropriate design just make better services for everyone, and the code becomes almost redundant. I think it will never become fully redundant, but I hope that it will become the norm to do those things. by default on the case of the online services without being told to.
I love that. I love that. And that happens when it's profitable too, right? When it's profitable, and that starts with us as parents helping to enable, and kids enabling as well, that these are the right ways, and thus profitability follows when it's done in this sustainable, compliant fashion. Beeben, wrap us up, please.
So I obviously want what Jacob wants on a global level, which I think starts with having a code going through Congress, a standalone data protection code for children. And, you know, in my dreams, I would like President Biden to sign the Convention on the Rights of the Child so that America joins the rest of the world, in actually respecting children's autonomy as human beings.
That is a big one, because unfortunately it's got that UN in front of it, and not well loved in this country. I'll just, it's kind of a half and half thing, right? But
I started with the word convention.
yes, and I love that you're wishing for beautiful things too, because that's that's something that we can all get behind, broadly speaking. I want to thank the four of you. I think this was a very insightful, valuable. I think people learned a lot. I think actually the lack of Q&A should point to you that you had a rapt audience that was like, I want to hear the next words and the next words and the next words. I want to thank all of you. You are leaders in this field, and it is an important leadership. It is so important to our future, as has been said a couple of times. And so thank you so much for your time, your efforts, your mission, your calling, your operationalization, and for bringing children and parents together as we meet this challenge of online interaction for children. Thank you for your time. I hope that all of us are getting together again with some regularity to advance this mission together. And again, For Humanity is literally at the service of all of you as you may need it. So thank you to the audience for the few questions that we had and for being here and listening. We will take a slightly longer break, about 15 minutes, before we get into our last sort of more socializing, networking session, talking about how to be in the space of independent audit, how to be in the space of creating this transparency, the solutions associated with the Children's Code, GDPR, everything like that. So I hope you'll stick around and join us for that chit chat. It's going to be a chit chat. Finally, we get to interact with people in the audience, like actually interact, which I just demanded, because this talking to myself or to the camera or to just like 3 or 4 of you kind of drives me crazy. Like I want to see the people who are, I got to ask the question, that kind of thing. So at least we get that for the last session. But thank you again, and appreciate your time. And we'll see everybody in about 15 minutes. What is For Humanity? We are a nonprofit charitable organization built for a singular mission to examine and analyze downside risk associated with AI and autonomous systems, and where possible, to identify risk mitigations to manage those downside risks and get the best possible result from these systems for humanity. We are a volunteer-driven organization with 450 contributors and fellows from 46 countries around the world, building an infrastructure of trust with independent audit of AI systems. A crowdsourced process where we've drafted over 5,000 lines of audit criteria for AI and autonomous systems of many kinds. We provide these audit rules to governments and regulators. We do not have authority and we do not seek authority. We aim to be a service provider to governments and regulators around the world. We also advise and train those jurisdictions about the roles and responsibilities that exist in an infrastructure of trust. A big part of this process is to ensure human agency remains over these systems, requiring diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback, not at the outcomes level, but at the design, development, and risk assessment level, to ensure feedback loops to manage these risks and maximize perspectives. We also have identified accountability and governance structures inside organizations to ensure that compliance is met. Our approach is multi-vector. It focuses on 5 specific categories that are a holistic approach to AI and autonomous systems: ethics, bias, privacy, trust, and cybersecurity. What we do is an art. We craft laws, regulations, guidelines, and standards into auditable rules. That means they are binary, and auditors are able to correctly assess if compliance has been met or not met. We also work with accreditation services to create a process for accrediting entities to issue certifications of compliance. And finally, we train and certify individuals to perform audit and pre-audit service. For Humanity is not an auditor, nor a pre-audit service provider. We do this training to ensure that individuals know how to certify companies, how to see compliance, how to recognize that documentary evidence has satisfied these criteria. And we also provide a body of knowledge, a way to see when complex issues of compliance have met sufficient and necessary standards to achieve compliance and to mitigate risks to humans. This is who we are, this is what we do, and we do it on behalf of humanity.
Hello, I'm Sarah Clark. I'm one of the For Humanity Fellows, and I was asked to talk a little bit about the body of knowledge and how that relates to what For Humanity does in general.
My name is Joshua Buckley. I'm a fellow for Humanity, and I'm here today to offer a peek into some of the work that For Humanity is doing, in particular with regards to the BOK, or the body of knowledge.
The For Humanity body of knowledge is information and reference points and benchmarks and external guidance that links to the subsets of criteria that we have in our full humanity audits. We've built all these audit criteria, and we realise that if we're training certified auditors across all of these varying domains, across privacy, bias, ethics, security, trust, we need to make sure that they have confidence in the depth of knowledge necessary to work out if something is a sufficient control, to look for signs that it may be insufficient control to pass the audit, and to signpost best practice or mature practice and ways to reach that point. The body of knowledge is split down into discipline relevant knowledge stores. Those knowledge stores have owners. Oftentimes those owners are not what you might consider to be a subject matter expert in the field, but what they are doing is gathering together those people with the very best current knowledge in those fields and coordinating the input into a standard format so we can share that with our certified auditors as part of the accredited training courses that we're offering to enable people to then perform audits against our criteria.
As Sarah mentioned, the BOK is a repository of best practices that is designed to supplement the learning outcomes and audit rules that make up for Humanities audit certification. Let's take the Code of Ethics knowledge store, for example. We see that line 17 in the audit states that entities shall have a Code of Ethics adhering to industry standards and in compliance with the relevant legal frameworks, and that this code shall be published in the entity's employee handbook. But what are industry standards for a Code of Ethics? What should an auditor look for when judging the quality of a Code of Ethics? How can an auditor tell whether an entity's Code of Ethics appropriately sets out the legal frameworks that are relevant to said code and the entity in question? These are the kinds of questions that can influence the confidence with which an auditor is able to make his or her determinations about compliance. And they are the kinds of questions that the BOK in general, and knowledge stores in particular, are designed to clarify. As a result, each knowledge store puts forward a detailed definition of the concept in question, as well as setting out a list of criteria for sufficiency, things that must be present within the Code of Ethics for an auditor to confidently make an assertion about compliance, as well as indicators of maturity, things which, if present, signal that the Code of Ethics goes above and beyond what is required by the audit. In the case of codes of ethics, sufficiency includes things like, was the code drafted and is it kept up to date by the entity's ethics committee? Does it clearly set out the entity's shared moral framework? And does it contain compliance-based, value-based, and fiduciary-based commitments or considerations? Indicators of maturity, on the other hand, include things like, does the code provide explicit context to the sorts of ethical choices that employees will be making? Does it include a commitment to making employees aware of the code and its contents? Is the code long enough to provide enough detail, but short enough to act as a reasonable and usable ethical guide for employees? Overall, the BOK and knowledge stores like that for the Code of Ethics are integral to the work that For Humanity does, will be integral to the work that auditors do, and can be an amazing place to get started as a new contributor or fellow. So I urge you all to get involved and would like to invite anyone who is interested or who has any questions to reach out to Sarah, Ryan, or myself for more information.
We will only be able to create this infrastructure of trust, this audit of AI on behalf of humanity, for humanity, if we invite everybody to the table and incorporate the best of those views into the best kind of guidance.